When I first saw the TV adaptation of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, it left me scratching my head. I'd heard that it was one of Agatha Christie's most famous stories, on par with Murder on the Orient Express, and Then There Were None, and the ABC murders. But there was nothing I could see that was really that remarkable about it. It was just kind of average, and the murderer was pretty obvious. It wasn't bad, just meh. What could have made it so important? Then I read the book. We need to discuss this. First of all, before we talk about the story, we need to establish some context. Unlike with other books, it's important to understand where this falls in the Poirot chronology. It was published in 1926, and at this point there had been 2 novels and 3 books worth of short stories, all featuring Poirot's friend, Captain Hastings. He was well established as the Dr. Watson of the Poirot series. He was the narrator, he was the detective's assistant, and he came off as somewhat dim. The only difference between him and Watson, apart from not being a doctor, is that Hastings really is dim, oftentimes face-palmingly so. He also has a preference for ladies with auburn hair, not red hair, but auburn hair. It's important. Now, in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, for the very first time, we're introduced to a new Captain Hastings, Dr. James Shepherd. This time he really is a doctor. He's the narrator, he acts as assistant to Poirot, and he may not be altogether that dim, but he shares enough commonalities with his predecessor that Poirot asks him, "Have you also a penchant for auburn hair?" What's important is that readers of the time period went into this story having gotten used to a particular formula. Poirot and Hastings would investigate, they'd both observe the same clues, Hastings would draw a conclusion that would seem somewhat sensible, but in the end would turn out to be wildly inaccurate, and then Poirot would reveal the true solution and show Hastings why he should have arrived at it too. That's all that readers had to go on. There had been no murder on the Orient Express, Poirot had never sailed down the Nile, and there were no dead bodies on Soldier Island. There had been twists before, but nothing that had completely changed the genre. Now we can begin. Plot-wise, the adaptation follows the book quite closely. Sure, there's the addition of a second murder, and a few characters are missing, but all in all there are really only 2 major alterations. With that in mind, I'm going to deviate from my normal format and go through the whole book before looking at the film. The story takes place in a village called King's Abbot and begins just after the suicide of Mrs. Ferrars. One of those. Dr. Shepherd is called in when her body is found. Shepherd's sister, Caroline, is the village gossip queen. She says Mrs. Ferrars was consumed with guilt over having murdered her abusive husband. Roger Ackroyd, the life and soul of the village, confides in Dr. Shepherd that he and Mrs. Ferrars had been secretly engaged. That night, at his home, Ackroyd reveals another secret. Someone drove his fiancée to suicide by blackmailing her over the murder of her husband. He resolves to find this person and make them suffer. He receives a letter from Mrs. Ferrars and is about to learn the blackmailer's identity. Dr. Shepherd goes home, and just over an hour later he gets a phone call. Roger Ackroyd has been murdered. He rushes back, but the butler says he hasn't telephoned. They check on Ackroyd and find that he has indeed been killed. Everyone in the Ackroyd household falls under suspicion, including Roger's stepson, Ralph Peyton, his niece, Flora, his sister-in-law, Mrs. Ackroyd, whose first name we never learn, his secretary, Geoffrey Raymond, the butler, Parker, the housekeeper, Miss Russell, the parlour-maid, Ursula Bourne, and Ackroyd's friend, Major Blunt. There was also a strange man whom Shepherd passed on his way home. Ralph becomes the prime suspect due to his strange behavior lately, as well as the fact that he's disappeared. Flora, who's engaged to Ralph, asks for help from Dr. Shepherd's next-door neighbor, who turns out to be the famous Hercule Poirot. He's been living incognito in the village since his retirement, following the events of the Big Four. He takes the case and seems to take a quick liking to Dr. Shepherd. The 2 of them team up to solve the murder and save Ralph, whom Poirot believes is innocent. Anyone who likes clues in a murder mystery won't have anything to complain about here. Among the many clues are a gold wedding ring found in a pond, a chair in Ackroyd's study that changed position twice on the night of the murder, some missing cash, and 3 people who say they saw or heard Ackroyd in the hour before the phone call reporting his death. The police discover the phone call was made not from the house, but from a nearby train station. Now, I said I wouldn't talk about the film till I'd gone through the book, but just one thing. In the book, Poirot gathers the suspects and says they're each hiding something, and he needs them all to stop holding back. He scares them a little bit.
Fear! That is that!
As a result, a few of the suspects come clean, but only in the book. Poirot has a reason for everything he does, but in the film, without his behavior eliciting any response from anyone, it seems like he does this just out of spite and aggravation. Maybe it's supposed to tie into the new subplot where Poirot feels conflicted about having retired from his career as a detective, but it still feels out of character. Anyway, the book starts to wrap things up with twist after twist. The mysterious stranger is Miss Russell's secret drug addict son. Ralph and Ursula are secretly married, and the reason no one can find Ralph is that Dr. Shepherd has had him in hiding. That's right, long before Kaiser Sose, this was the original unreliable narrator story. Okay, fine, maybe not the original one, but still. Then, after he and Shepherd are alone, Poirot takes it one step further. Not only was Dr. Shepherd concealing Ralph Payton, not just from the police, but from us, the readers, he was also concealing the fact that he was the blackmailer and the murderer, the narrator, the detective's assistant, the Hastings of this story is the villain. And that is how Agatha Christie became a household name, because no one had pulled that stunt before. And just to be clear, this is not an M. Night Shyamalan thing. The novel has way more to offer than just the twist at the end. What primarily carried the story all the way through was the hilarious relationship between Shepherd and his sister. And there were plenty of clues pointing us to the solution, including the chair that changed position to block the view of the dictaphone Shepherd used to fake an alibi by playing recorded voices after Ackroyd was dead. There were so many hints throughout the story, like when Poirot sent Shepherd on fact-finding missions, making us think they were important, but really he was just getting the doctor out of the way so he could question his sister. That's how he figured out which of Shepherd's patients faked the phone call that got Shepherd to the scene to discover the body and retrieve the dictaphone. Wow, every time I reread this book, I spot something new to make me go, oh. At the end, the story itself turns out to be Shepherd's confession and suicide note. He kills himself using the same sleeping drug as Mrs. Ferrars. His one wish is that Caroline never finds out about his crimes, so it's unclear whether the truth is ever made public. So, how would one go about adapting this into a film? A film isn't a manuscript, so how could you translate the essence of this story without that gimmick? Well, basically, you can't, but you can get close. You can approximate the impact of the denouement by incorporating at least one of its core elements. Option A, make Dr. Shepherd the detective's assistant and tell the story primarily from his point of view. Option B, make him the narrator. Start with a flash-forward of him writing the story and have intermittent voiceovers. Option C, make this the third or later in a series of Poirot films which up to now have all co-starred Hastings, and make it clear that Shepherd is the replacement co-star. Now, which of these options did the TV adaptation choose? Was Dr. Shepherd the new Hastings? Not in the slightest. Did he assist Poirot with the case? Barely. Did he narrate the story? Well, sort of. But not really. The film begins with Poirot reading a journal written by the killer of Roger Ackroyd. It's read aloud in Poirot's voice, and it's at the moment when Caroline finds the journal that we realize Shepherd is the murderer. At least, that's what I figure was the intention. Personally, I knew Shepherd did it the moment he picked up the phone. It's an interesting way to reveal the killer, but in truth only superficially representative of the source material. Sure, in both cases the narrator is the murderer, but it doesn't mean anything if you know that from the beginning. The original climax is lost, replaced by this lame chase scene. Plus, after reading hundreds of pages narrated by this normal-sounding dude, it comes off as such a shock that he's a cold-blooded killer. The journal in the film is so full of condescension and scorn, it makes it seem as if Dr. Shepherd is hiding his true self behind a mask of normalcy. And sure, that can be a thing, but it's the opposite of what Agatha Christie was trying to say. A person can be completely normal and murderous. If you're adapting a work of literature that's this important, you should understand its themes, let alone incorporate the thing that made the work important in the first place. This does not do it justice. I should mention there are other adaptations of this novel. There's the 1931 film Alibi with Austin Trevor, which is considered a lost film. There's the Japanese version that's over 3 hours long, and there's a Russian version too. I haven't seen any of these. This video is solely about the David Suchet version. But if and when I do see them, if any of them succeeds in doing the book justice, I'll be sure to mention it. One more thing before I go. After Ackroyd, Christie wrote other novels narrated by side characters, prompting readers to suspect she might pull the same trick again, which she did once. Thanks for watching.